Okay, hello and welcome to another sales chat. My name is John Golden from SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine, Pipeliner CRM. I'm joined as always by my colleague, Martha Neumeister, who is in Vienna today.
Hi, guys.
Yeah, hi. I'm here in lovely San Diego, and we are joined by Greg Dunne, who is in Florida. So we've covered East Coast, West Coast, and Europe. Greg is the founder and CEO of Mansfield Sales Partners. He uses his executive sales and management experience to help companies around the world to design, implement, and test their sales strategies. He works with the C-suite. His team can work on sales strategy, messaging, all of those great things with you. So he's well qualified to talk on our subject today, which is common sales mistakes and, of course, how to avoid them, rather than how to make them. So welcome, Greg.
Well, thank you very much, John and Martha. Thanks for having me. I had a lot of pearls of wisdom to share with you today, but the first thing that comes to mind is I'm based in Boston, and I'm currently doing some work down in Florida. And when I left Boston, it was -3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about -19 Celsius. And here in Florida, it's about 78 degrees. So the first common sales mistake that people make is not moving to where it's warm, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Or at least maybe having a territory that's split. So maybe in the wintertime you work in Florida, and in the summertime you work in the Northeast. Yeah, well, I do. As you know, there's been a lot of crazy weather, especially in the northeastern part of the country. So I bet you're glad to be taking respite from it down in Florida. Okay, so let's talk about common sales mistakes. Okay, so there's some basic ones that we all know about. There's the, selling to the wrong people or not qualifying your prospects properly. What are some of the other mistakes you see, Greg? Maybe some of the less common or obvious ones, maybe.
Well, first of all, we only have a limited amount of time today, and the mistakes that we see out in the wild would take more time than we would have today. So I'm going to try to focus on a few of the things that I think are not common, like you said, but really can make a difference in helping people to be able to achieve their targets. And the most common thing that I've seen in my 35-year career is, essentially people selling scared. People going into organizations and meetings and asking questions, looking for yeses, and then moving swiftly on to the next question that they may have once they feel like they can check the box with a yes, and not really digging and adding to the tension necessary to be able to understand what the customers are really thinking and what they're likely to be saying, after your sales call is done behind closed doors. And so, in many ways, salespeople are kind of trained to, there are KPIs and there are metrics that are set up. How many calls did you make today? How many meetings did you have? How much pipeline do you have? And they're afraid at every step of the way that something's going to impact their ability to produce the results for things that happen before what really matters, which is generating revenue. And in fact, they treat the sales process and the meetings that they have with their customers almost like an obstacle course, where they see an obstacle and they work hard to get around that obstacle until the point where the client is, being all nice and saying yes to things. And then they move on to the next obstacle. And in fact, what I see more is like a demolition derby, where people need to meet these obstacles head on, crash into them, ask hard, uncomfortable questions, understand the rationale that maybe a yes isn't really a yes. For example, maybe there's an 800-pound gorilla in the market space, and you're kind of curious as to, why aren't you evaluating the person or the company that everybody already knows? But instead of asking that, they just kind of move through those things. So
I like that concept, what you just said of selling scared. I mean, do you think in some ways we're to blame for creating that environment where salespeople kind of, they look on, oh my God, I've got this meeting with the prospect, or either in person or online or on the phone, whatever it is today, I can't screw it up.
Absolutely. And it's not just I can't screw it up, but I have this outcome in mind, and I'm going to leave that room feeling like I've achieved that outcome, whether I actually have or not.
Right.
And in reality, what's going to happen is you're going to end up in some meetings where you're going to ask hard questions and you're going to ask pressures that are going to endanger your deal at various points. And that's okay. At the end of the day, the deals that are the right deals are going to happen. Even if you add those tensions, it's not like somebody doesn't know that, your pricing might be an issue, or that there's, other people in the space that have more market share than you do. They know that, and you need to address those issues and then dig into why they think your solution might be the best one for them.
So if you're going in with, with this laser focus on a particular outcome, right? Let's be honest. I mean, you've been around long enough. How often?
What do you mean by that, John? I
mean, yeah. Hey, listen, we've all been around a long time. Let's be honest here. Unlike Martha, who's the spring chicken here. Right? So a lot of people go in with one outcome in mind, and the chances of you getting the exact outcome you're looking for, it's often pretty slim, right? So do you think that one of the biggest mistakes people make is not going in, not having, not thinking out alternative outcomes?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's well said. I think that it's not just not thinking out alternative outcomes, but it's actually, even deeper than that, which is they're really not putting themselves into the shoes of the people that are buying. The people that are buying are smart. They're going to evaluate a number of solutions or a number of different services. They're going to decide which one connects with them the best, which one solves the pain, which one falls into the acceptable standards within their organization, and then they're gonna drive forward with vendors, and they're gonna end up picking the ones where the solution is the obvious outcome for them, but also with the people that they like, with the vision that for the company that is most consistent. As Simon Sinek would say, people buy from people who believe what you believe. And ultimately, you need to get them to the point where you're curious, where you're empathetic, and where you're really understanding the kind of challenges that they have, so that you can best position your solution, to solve their problem, and and in addition, make them like you.
Right. So what you've just described, right? You make them like you, be empathetic, all of that stuff, right? That's pretty hard to do if you're selling scared, right?
Yeah, no, it's really impossible to do that if you're selling scared. If I go into a meeting and it's a tremendous meeting, but it turns out that the questioning that I used, or the conversation led us into a direction where I'm not sure we're going to win, or maybe we're not going to win. Somebody has to go back and tell a boss that this deal isn't looking like it's where I thought it was. It's not because of salesmanship. It's not. It's just the way deals work. Some will fall off, but I would rather go back to my boss when I was carrying a bag and carrying quota, and tell them that this is what happened, and this is why, for instance, maybe we're not going to win this particular deal earlier in the sales cycle, rather than setting an expectation that this thing's going to come in any day now, and then finding out later on that you weren't even close. And I see that a lot.
Yeah, that's, I mean, I know from experience as well, that's one of the most frustrating things, like when you're running a company or when you're running a sales team. It's when somebody takes you on this fantastical journey down the sales cycle, and they're convincing you all along that this is going to happen, and then it falls apart at the last moment. And then, like you say, you discover it was never going to happen anyway. So that takes, again, I mean, we're talking about scared. So that takes a lot of nerve and kind of self-awareness or whatever from a salesperson to early in the sales cycle take it back and say, listen, here are the reasons why this isn't going to happen. So do you think that some salespeople, they don't do it like deliberately, or they kind of fool themselves? I call the scenario of happy ears, when you start hearing what you want to hear. So how do you avoid, as a salesperson, falling into the trap of having happy ears?
Well, there's a few things there, John, and I agree with everything that you just said. I think that people are generally kind. Customers don't want to deliver bad news to you. They don't want to be the ones to create the tension. They're not going to tell you everything that you need to know in order to be able to position your product or service in a way that makes you the number one contender for the deal. And so it's up to you to add that tension, to ask hard questions, to do the things that are necessary, to dig into the yes answers. Even though you got to a yes, that's not good enough. You need to get to you need to understand the motivations behind the yes, and you need to understand some of the obstacles that remain in front of you. You need to add those tensions so that you can address them head on. And then you need to move on to the next thing. And in the course of a conversation, you can uncover a lot of things that if you think like the customer, you would want to know. And if you anticipate those kinds of questions, then you can do a better job, winning deals, but also eliminating them earlier in the cycle in instances where, look, you're just never going to win the deal. There's somebody that's already selected, and you're the second or third player that they brought in. Just compare and contrast.
So how much of this is can be a product of basically not doing sufficient planning in advance?
Well, it certainly has a lot to do with training. It has a lot to do with understanding the marketplace and also understanding the people and the buyer personas around the folks who are making the decisions. So if you understand how they do their job, what their obstacles are, what other competitors may exist, what other tools they may be using, the more you know about how these people do their job and what's changing in the marketplace and what's causing them to consider adding something new to their, to either their technology suite or a new service or whatever it is that you're trying to sell, the better you can do in kind of anticipating their thought process and then leading them through this demolition derby in a way that, gets to the most important questions first.
Yeah, because one of the things, like when I was running Huthwaite and spin selling, Neil Rack and spin selling, and one of the things that we used to always talk to people about is, that a clients or prospects perceive problems. They're not all created equally, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the traps that a salesperson can fall into is the first time they hear a problem, they jump on it and they go, "Oh, fantastic! Customer's got a problem," and they just go. They latch onto that instead of exploring it in detail. Is this a problem that they care to solve? Is this really a big enough problem? And maybe there are other problems that are far greater than this, but I've latched onto this one. So again, as a salesperson, how do you ensure that you stay kind of a little bit more open-minded in the earlier parts of the sales process?
Well, I'm going to try to answer that question and stop me if I'm a little off track here. But people often ask me, what's the number one attribute you look for in a sales professional? And my answer has always been curiosity. And so if people are genuinely curious, they're going to ask questions that advance the conversation and really get to know the customer and the customer's problems and the customer's job a little bit better than if they're faking this curiosity. So if you go in and you're asking questions and you really want to know the answer, I use very simple analogies like, if you're talking about, just you're on a conference call with a customer and you want to know what's the weather in Chicago today. You can make small talk all day long, but the people that I hire, they really want to know what the weather is in Chicago today because hey, I'm curious. I have family in Chicago, whatever the motivation may be, and that's a very simplistic case of as you're selling your product or service, you should be curious about what are these people currently doing to do their job better? What are their career aspirations? Where were they before? You should be looking, carefully at, LinkedIn and all the social media ways that people use now to understand what they're talking about and what they're saying. There's automated process for this, but there's nothing like good old fashioned hard work where when I walk into a room, I know something about the attendees. I have notes and I can understand, look, I'm going to adopt something that may be considered dangerous, a new technology, for instance, because, I'm looking to advance my career and separate myself from other folks versus, people that may be at a point in their career where they're not looking for advancement so much as stability and, and efficiencies. And so, as you become curious and as you ask these questions, the conversation as you're pitching will lead you in a direction that will get you to understand how to position your stuff better than the other guy.
Yeah, no, I like what you've outlined there because one of the things that I always remind people is in B2C purchasing, right? If you and I go out tomorrow, if I go this evening and purchase a 52 million inch flat screen TV or whatever, the latest and greatest, I come home, what's the worst that can happen to me, right? My wife can hit me over the head with it and say, you just wasted money that we could have spent elsewhere. Right. So it's limited. It might be uncomfortable, but it's limited. In B2B purchasing, right, it can be career enhancing, it can be career limiting. There's a lot of stress that goes into making a decision. And I think what you just touched upon there is the motivation of the person who is maybe charged with or heading up the team that's purchasing, and different people have different things riding on it. So do you think that salespeople do enough investigation generally of really trying to uncover the motivations of the individuals as opposed to the motivations of the company?
Sometimes, but rarely. Too rarely. I'm just not seeing people understand that, everybody has a boss, everybody has a job. What's the driving factor? There may be a big layoff at an organization that you're trying to sell into, and maybe it's pending, and maybe they're looking for efficiencies that will allow them to do more work with fewer people, and and if you just take it at face value, that they're buying your stuff because it's really good, and it's going to help, and you're not really understanding, so why suddenly is this risen to the top of your priority list? Something's going on. I have a new boss and I'm trying to impress them, or I'm losing some key people who used to do a particular job function. I need to figure out a way to simplify that particular function for the next person coming in. There's all kinds of catalysts for people making change. It's rarely they wake up one day and say, "Thank God you called," because I was here wondering, how I could buy this new thing that nobody ever heard of. There's some reason that they either reached out to you or they took a call from you when you reached out to them.
Yeah. And, there may be the case that that their boss told them to look into this, but they don't really want to, or whatever. There's a lot of things going on. So the more investigation you can do of personal motivations, the better. So let's see, what are some other maybe less obvious mistakes that you see salespeople make?
Well, I think that the pitch that you have to use to sell your product is different at different stages of the sales cycle. And so I see people who are trained by their organization to pitch a certain way. Here's our elevator pitch, here are our solution statements, whatever kind of sales training you get, whether it's Sandler or spin selling or consultative selling or whatever, they're using the same kind of outline to approach the customer the same way at each stage. Whereas, for instance, if you make a cold call to somebody, right, you can't give your pitch the same way as if you're in a room full of people, vying to become the finalist in some RFP proposal. And so I don't see people altering the way they're actually selling. If you have a cold call, which is the most extreme way to sell something, right? The sales cycle can't be longer and it can't be harder than with a cold call, but they're very important and they're incredibly necessary. You have maybe 20 seconds to capture somebody's attention. You have to take a shot, and you go in quick, and you say maybe one thing, and maybe that one thing it's accurate, but it's not precise. And you start the person thinking about why they might want to engage in a conversation. Now, you can't use that same messaging and that same one thing when you're in a room trying to do something different. And so I don't think that their toolkit that most salespeople carry around in their head or through through technology is designed to be the same at different stages of the sales cycle. Yet too often I see the same messaging and I hear the same thing throughout the entire sales process.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So that takes a little bit of skill, doesn't it, to alter your pitch at different times during the sales cycle. And yeah, you're right. I think sometimes we get comfortable with a particular message and we just stay on message, almost like a politician. Stay on message, don't get taken off message, rather than develop it as we go.
Yeah, and I don't think, when you're trying to introduce something to somebody, if you're starting at the very beginning of the sales cycle through a cold call or even, through a response to, a trade show lead or something like that, I don't think you have the time to really just show up and the old show up and throw up kind of methodology of going on and droning on about why your product or service is so wonderful. You really have to engage with that customer differently than when you've made it through those hurdles and, kind of you understand, who you're talking to and what their motivations are. And then you change things up a little bit to become maybe more product centric. And then, at the end, where it has a lot to do with relationships and vision and roadmap, you're introducing different players from your company, you're targeting different people, you're messaging differently, and the questions and the conversation needs to be directed very differently.
Yeah. Okay. So far we've talked about selling scared. We've talked about adjusting your message as you go through the sales cycle. But what's another less obvious mistake that you see?
Well, I don't know how it's January. It's January 11th, and we're coming off a whole bunch of people who have just come off year end, right? Mm-hmm. And so one of the common techniques for year end is to get deals in by the end of the year by offering discounting and incentives, which is something that generally drives me crazy anyway, because the salesperson's approach to offering incentives to close a deal according to a specific timeline gets treated more like a punitive measure than it does as a favor, right? So it's not the customer's problem that it's the end of my quarter or it's the end of my month or I'm one deal away from President's Club. That's my problem. I own that. And if I approach the customer by offering something that makes it seem like, if you do this according to my timeline, then A will happen. But if you don't, all hell is going to break loose and you're going to pay exorbitant. That doesn't work. And so I think that good salespeople have the capacity to build a relationship with the customer where by the end of a selling cycle, they're actually okay with asking for a favor. I sometimes tell customers, as a sales manager, I'll say, this is a really important deal for Mary. And she's been working really hard. And I know this is my problem, not your problem. But if there's any way we could facilitate getting this deal done by the end of the year, I'm prepared to offer some incentives or to do some things so that your management will think that that's okay. And at the same time, you'll really be helping us out. And just like I said at the beginning of the call, people are generally kind. They'll respond to that. They won't respond to I'm going to give you 20% off, but on January 1st, it goes back to full price, because it never goes back to full price anyway. You're kidding yourself and you're adding a tension that doesn't need to be added.
So I like what you're saying there about the idea of kind of being more, it's kind of a more open and genuine, honest approach where you're saying this is really going to help me. It's going to help you too because I'm giving you discounts, but it's really going to help me. And that's kind of the motivation right now. And if you see value in what we're doing, if we built a good relationship, then this is hopefully something that you can contemplate.
Exactly. I mean, sales is it's all about relationships. When I interview salespeople, I ask them, questions like, if you were going to have a party, if you were going to throw a wedding, how many people in that you invite would have been customers of yours? What kind of relationships? I've heard another person recently told me they ask people, how many customers do you text with, right? Like, once you get there and you have this relationship, frankly, sometimes whether they buy from you or not, they often do, but sometimes they don't. It's really important to kind of have the relationships where you're okay asking the kinds of questions that separate you from just the sales guy who walks in, who he's delivering a message or he or she are delivering a message and they're doing fine and they're able to describe their product really well and they may know a lot about the market, but they're missing that connection that will allow the open and honest dialogue that people need to understand where they stand in a deal and how they need to act in order to be able to navigate some of the last minute hurdles that usually show up when you're trying to close.
Well, that's a great way to bookend the conversation because, again, it gets back to confidence, doesn't it? And being able to sell with confidence, because you can't really develop that kind of relationship if you're always scared, right? If you're staring, wondering, hopefully I don't step on any landmines, hopefully I don't do this, and so it's hard to develop that kind of open and honest and that connection if you're running scared.
Understood. Yes, and I'd also like to address the managers out there, the executive CEOs, the sales managers. Sure. Don't put your people into a position where they're afraid to deliver news to you. It could be good news, it could be bad news, but it's news. look, here's what I'm learning. Here's what we've discovered. Sometimes maybe a big deal will be less certain than you thought it may be, or sometimes, sometimes your pipeline will go down for a short period of time. But at the end of the day, what I deal with is a lot of sales managers who know that, look, I have the skill set that I believe I would have closed that deal.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly you don't, because the deal isn't closing for whatever reason. And my viewpoint is a little bit different than the person on the street. Yes, I could take the approach where every deal is a high percentage I need to close. Like, I want my yield to be really high.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can take the approach is, look, I'm looking for a broad base of qualified pipeline where some deals can afford to be lost and some deals will be won, and I have enough that I know that I can get to my number or exceed my number. Mm-hmm. And if managers are goaling them on artificial activity-based metrics that come before the important things, which is pipeline and closing, right, then they're setting a bad example where people are going to be terrified to engage in the kind of conversation that's necessary for you to win big deals.
Mm-hmm. No, that's great advice, and I hope the sales managers take that on board, because another phrase that I used to use a lot is the feel-good funnel. That one where you have everything stuffed in the early stages. You've tons of opportunities. You're not closing much now, but you can at least say to your sales manager, and your sales manager can say to their boss, "Ooh, things are a bit rough right now, but in a couple of months, whoa, it's going to be fantastic." What happens in a couple of months? Well, guess what? It's still rough, because most of those opportunities weren't real. Yeah. So keeping your pipeline focused. It takes some nerve, because, as you say, it often means shrinking the pipeline.
I often kind of joke around being in sales. Every good sales executive has been hired and fired in a number of different instances. And, I've never fired somebody in sales that wasn't one day away from the biggest deal that the company, right? And they wait and they wait and they wait. And the reality is that, yes, if you have really good salespeople who are able to develop relationships, it can impact the customer. But at the end of the day, people buy things that they need, people that advance their cause, whatever selfish reasons they have as a company or as an individual to buy from you. And, and that survives salespeople. So it's the salesperson's job to just kind of quarterback those deals and build those relationships so that all things being equal, you win.
Great. All right. Well, Greg, we're bumping up to the end of the half hour here. And what we always like to ask our guests to finish up is your power tip. Okay. What is the one thing that you do every day to set yourself up for success?
I like to know at the end of the day whether I've won. So I set goals for myself on a daily, monthly, and quarterly basis that allow me to go home at the end of a day and understand whether today I won or not. Did I have the number of meetings that I needed to have in order to be able to get to my goals? Did I make the phone calls that I needed to make in order to be able to continue my networking activities, or to cold call, or to do whatever it is? And so the power tip is really to set bite-sized goals for yourself on a daily basis, so that that if I set a goal if I do cold calls and I need to make 100 calls, I'm not going to leave when I've made 99 calls, right? So, what is it that's going to motivate my behavior and my enthusiasm, so each day I can feel like I won, whether or not a big purchase order comes through?
Love it. Great tip. All right, Greg, in the last couple of moments, why don't you tell people a little bit more about yourself and your company and how they can find out more and contact you?
Sure. My company's named Mansfield Sales Partners. It's at mansfieldsp.com. And we're a strategic advisory firm. We help organizations review their sales operations and better understand how to organize and enable their salespeople for maximum results. And so we work with a lot of CEOs, a lot of investors, a lot of private equity firms to kind of take a holistic approach at what does the sales organization need to look like to get you to the next stage of growth. And then we help them kind of turn the knobs and move the levers necessary to be able to build that organization without massively disrupting what already exists.
Oh, perfect. I love it. Anyway, thanks again, Greg Dunne. It's been a great sales chat. Thank you, Martha in Vienna, for running the Twitter chat. Everything ran smoothly today?
Yeah,
Perfect.
thanks. All perfect.
Okay. All right. This is John Golden, SalesPOP Online Sales Magazine and Pipeliner CRM. We'll see you for another live sales chat real soon. Thank you.
Thank you.